Okay, if you don't mind, we're recording this event. Feargal, would you be able to also switch on your recording? You all know Feargal Cochrane, Professor Feargal Cochrane is Professor Emeritus at the University of Kent. He has been with us since 2012 before joining University of Kent. He was a senior lecturer at Lancaster University, where he also led the Center on Conflict Resolution, the Richardson Center on Conflict Resolution. Feargal has been a very active member of our academic group, of our center, has also been vice president of the Political Science Association, the leading politics association in the UK. Since leaving Kent, Feargal has been extremely prolific since his early retirement, should I say, deployment. He has published 2 books, one on Brexit and Northern Ireland with Manchester University Press, and the second book that he's going to be talking about today, Fragile Peace in Northern Ireland Peace Process, Fragile Peace. Feargal, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Neil, and great to see everybody. And I'm going to try and share my screen here and get started. So let's see how that goes. Host disabled participant screen sharing.
I think I need to make you a host, Feargal. Just give me.
Okay. So until right, see whether. Okay, so okay, can you see my screen now? Can you see? Yes. Can you see my screen? Okay. Well, that's.
Yeah, it's all great. Thank you.
Well, that's a relief. Otherwise, it'd be a very short talk. So, first of all, thanks, Neil, for the invitation, and thanks to the school as well for inviting me to speak. It's great to be launching my book with CARC, as it's close to my heart. And really what I wanted to try and do I'm going to talk for maybe 30 minutes or so, and we're going to have a conversation as well about the themes about the book. So just want to say a little bit about the background of writing it, and why I wrote it, and why I updated it, because the Fragile Peace book, I realized the other day that my subtitles are really depressing in my books, and I must work on getting more optimistic subtitles, because they're either breaking peace or fragile peace or doomed peace. I haven't written that one yet, but hopeful peace or robust peace would be great to be able to write someday. So why I wrote it, the process of writing it and updating it, which wasn't actually as straightforward as I'd initially thought it would be, and then spend most of my time talking about the arguments that are in it and some of the themes that are emerging in it. So the origins of it, in a lot of ways, I've probably been writing the book my whole life, because the original book was published in 2013, but that was, I suppose, the culmination of about 25 years of teaching and researching and writing about Northern Ireland, and actually growing up there. And Yale had sort of, what they had wanted was what they call a crossover book. And so both books are this type of crossover book that connects with an academic audience, but in a popular way. So, I talk about things like consociationalism and centripetalism, but I tend not to use the words consociationalism and centripetalism. So one of the real sort of difficulties, I suppose, in the book was, certainly in the first book, was being able to satisfy both of those types of audiences, one an academic audience and the other a more popular readership. And to some degree, what I did there as a technique was I brought in some of my own background and some of my own experiences of living in Northern Ireland as almost like vignettes for wider themes and wider conceptual issues to do with democracy, how you share power in divided societies, the role of memory, the role of emotion in and the interdisciplinarity of conflict as well. So some of it is about some, trying to draw these themes together using some of my own experiences. And the second revised version tries to do that as well, which is communicate. And it is, as many of us are academics know, we've all written books that cost £120, and really don't get beyond a university library. So it's quite a luxury to be able to write a book, that's relatively inexpensive and paperback and is marketed by the publisher. And one of the other things probably is, as Neil touched on there, had I not retired from Kent, it probably never would have been written because I just wouldn't have had time to update it. So most of the writing was done. So I retired from Kent in December 2019, I think it was. And most of the writing was done between January 2020 and October, November 2020. And then there was an epilogue slotted into the book after Christmas, because most of the book was written before the general election in the United Kingdom and before actually we knew what the final deal of the Brexit process was going to be. So just before publication, I had a couple of 1,000-word epilogue I was able to take advantage of to catch up with the election and the Northern Ireland Protocol in particular, because it was only really at Christmas that, or New Year, that the Brexit process became live in Northern Ireland, and the new trade border went up and then was reacted to. So we can maybe talk about that in the discussion if you want. But so the update was that's covered the first book, and there were some practical challenges, and some of you that have done, and I know Hugh has done many sort of versions of contemporary conflict resolution and may have come across this issue himself. But the first problem with revising the book was that I really had no manuscript to work from the published version. I had a PDF, but I didn't have a Word version. Might sound like a very sort of simplistic point to make, but I couldn't use a draft because I had to amend an existing published book. So I had to sort of try and convert PDF version of the book into a Word format, and then make sure that was exactly the right. I think Harmony's just joining us now, so hi Harmony. Make sure that was the right version, and then work from that. So there's a few sort of practical problems with it. The revised issue is, and the other thing was, the first issue was out in 2013, and Fragile Peace was really commissioned to mark the centenary of Northern Ireland, which is actually last week. So you would probably have to have been listening to the media quite carefully to notice it. But last Monday, May the 3rd, Northern Ireland was 100. And Fragile Peace was brought out to sort of mark the occasion. And you might think that, a centenary of a place is a non-problematic issue. But in Northern Ireland, the centenary has been quite sensitive, and responses to it have been not exactly uniform, and I'll talk about that in a second. But that was why the book was brought out in the first place, or was commissioned. It was actually a bigger undertaking than I initially thought. So there are two new chapters. There's a new chapter on Brexit, because the Breaking Peace book only really went up to mid-2019. And Breaking Peace, which Manchester University Press brought out, was really about the ins and outs of the negotiations from 2016 to 2019. Whereas Fragile Peace places Brexit more in a historical context and looks at it brings it up to date post 2020, but with the actual Northern Ireland Protocol and the response to that. But it tries to place Brexit in a almost as a rather than as a departure, actually as a continuation of British policy in Ireland. And I'm going to explain why that is the case in a sec. So there's two new chapters. There's one on Brexit, and there's one really on the centenary, on Northern Ireland hitting the ton and being 100, and really asking the question, what are its potential futures? How does Brexit and other things complicate Northern Ireland's constitutional position? How far into its second century is it going to get, or potentially going to get? So, and that's very much in the front of academic and policy debate now in Ireland, which is, you know, looking ahead to change, and whether change should be resisted or embraced or discussed. So, so there's two new chapters, but there's also several other chapters that had to be completely gutted. And so there's a chapter on devolution, and most of that has been rewritten because it only really went up to about 2012 initially. So I've had to sort of cover that 8-year period and rewrite that chapter. And then there was also a chapter on violence and post-conflict violence, which sounds like a paradox. But there's plenty of violence in Northern Ireland, plenty of sectarianism there, and really that chapter again was very dated because it was written in up to 2011, 2012. But we've had, you know, again another 8 years of tension. So that chapter, even though two of the chapters look the same in the contents page, there's really 4 new chapters in the book. So there's probably about 50,000 new words altogether between deletions and additions in the book, even though there's just two additional chapters. I was pleased to get some pictures into the book, and this particular one is an Anthony Gormley sculpture, which is in Derry, and there are 3 versions of this statue in different parts of Derry's walls from Anthony Gormley, and to me they're a sort of perfect metaphor for some of the conflict issues in Northern Ireland, because essentially what you have is a cast iron, 2 identical cast iron statues welded together. One looks out of the city, the other looks into the city. They can never meet eye to eye, but they look identical to external observers. And I think it was you know, it's quite a sort of, I suppose, a abstract type of conflict symbol, but to me it's very poignant. And I was pleased to get that photograph into the book and hopefully explain it. And so really the book maps these conflict identities and how they've evolved. And they have evolved, not necessarily progressively, but we've certainly changed. The book then looks at why violence emerged in the 1960s, why peace emerged. I've got peace in scare quotes most of the time, but why peace emerged in the 1990s, and why it's been so difficult to implement the peace. So Northern Ireland is 100 years old, but we're still struggling to come to terms with sharing power, with recognizing alternative identities and seeing a joint project. And the nub of the whole issue to me, in terms of making peace there, is that there is still very little that is considered to be a joint enterprise. And there's much more that actually is seen as one community's issue or another community's issue, and more of a bargaining tug of war going on than an integrative relationship over identity, particularly. So a lot of the book really looks at why the peace has been so difficult to, and so fragile, and so problematic. So there's sort of 4 themes here, and I'm going to throw some poetry into the mix in a second, so brace yourselves for that. But the first theme is that there is no history in Northern Ireland. There are histories. There is no accepted narrative of the past. There's different readings of our past, and those readings are often in tension. And so, you know, I used to say to my students, has anybody here celebrated the Battle of Bosworth lately? and they all would look at me and laugh at me, and as usual, and say, of course not, except one or two, particularly, I suppose, historically minded people. But the point I was trying to make to them was that we remember 1690 because it still matters, because it's still relevant, because history has not receded into some cultural forum. You know, history is still with us. History is interpreted as part of an ongoing political identification. And there is certainly very little accepted historical narrative. Second point is that, and which is sort of linked, is that issues of legitimacy linked to political institutions are contextual and are on a spectrum. There is no, you know, accepted legal authority. I mean, obviously I'm being slightly simplistic there, but issues of legitimacy, political legitimacy, and identity, and who victims are, it's still part of a struggle, and it's still highly contextual in the region. The third point that the book makes is that our history of conflict over the last century is not inevitable. It's not hopeless. It's the result of structural dynamics. People there are not abnormal. The people that you'll be relieved to hear, people in Northern Ireland are normal. But as Catch-22 told us, if you live in a mad world, sometimes the only sane thing to do is to be mad yourself. And the structures that surrounded people, political structures, economic structures, and to some degree the cultural divisions and social divisions, they created the agency, or certainly maybe not create the agency, but they certainly influenced the agency of people who lived there. And one of the things that really, I suppose, drove me to write the book was a frustration with the notion that the conflict was inevitable. And I think this is relevant to other divided places as well, that the conflict was not inevitable. So let's manage the conflict. Let's get an acceptable level of violence, which was the phrase used, because a solution is impossible. And I never believed that a solution was impossible. Difficult, certainly, but not impossible. And the other point I think that explains the conflict, and is a theme that goes through the book, is ignorance and ambivalence, particularly in outside of Northern Ireland itself. That it was a blind spot, particularly in Britain. Northern Ireland has been a blind spot, even though it is part of the United Kingdom. And the fourth and last point, really, that the book makes is that politics is not the preserve of politicians. Politics is done by all of us all the time, particularly people that say, I'm not political, I don't vote. I've never heard of a more political statement than that, which is, I'm not political, I don't vote. Because if you don't vote and you say you're not political, you are therefore, you know, creating an environment for other people to take advantage of. So highly political. So, but nonetheless, politics in the 1960s went on to the streets, and it never really returned. Obviously, we've had political institutions, but the political culture has quite often been one of mass participation. And the peace process saw that with the referendum. And the whole concept of the peace process in Northern Ireland was that the consent of the people would be sovereign. You know, the consent of people who lived there was what mattered. We'll come on to that in Brexit in a sec. So a couple of pictures there. That is the border in the 1970s between Newry and Dundalk. And you can't really understand unionism or nationalism unless you've got a working understanding of the past in Northern Ireland. And you can't understand the meaning of Brexit unless you understand the meaning of borders. And my point in both books really was that Northern Ireland was not on the agenda of the discussion when Brexit was debated. And an understanding of the border was just not there at all, apart from in Ireland. Another point to make there is that one of the themes that came through from the Brexit debate was, why are the Irish getting so neurotic about the legal guarantees that they may be given over border arrangements? Why can they not just sort of park that accept the good faith of the British government and get it, you know, and let's achieve workable solutions down the line, you know, with goodwill. And one of the reasons why this was a problem was because a lot of people in Ireland remembered partition, the last time a border was drawn in Ireland by Britain. And it was drawn in 1921, and it wasn't actually locked in until 1925. So you had massive paranoia going on over that period, plus a civil war in Ireland as a result. Plus a lot of violence in what became Northern Ireland as well. I mean, there was hundreds of people killed in 1920 and 1921 when after partition happened. The Boundary Commission was established as a mechanism to get Unionists and Nationalists to sign up to this original Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921. And it effectively underwrote the existing border arrangements in 1925. But the then Taoiseach of the Free State went to the British Prime Minister and said, "But you promised that, you know, that local opt-outs would be available and that that people could opt into the Free State if that was a county preference." And the British Prime Minister had changed by that point. It was Stanley Baldwin had taken over from David Lloyd George, and Stanley Baldwin said, "Well, you know, it wasn't so much a promise; it was more it certainly wasn't a guarantee. I mean, times have changed, and you know, we're in a different phase now than we were then." So Ireland learned a lesson then that sometimes promises from Britain might not be all that you might want them to be. And the border obviously carved a line through Ireland in 1921. And Brexit provided initially for the first couple of years of the negotiations, the spectre of another border being carved on the island of Ireland, which was quite a scary thought for a lot of people who lived there. So the past, in other words, somebody came up with the phrase that, you know, the past is always in front of us in Northern Ireland, which is quite a good way of putting it. We can never quite sort of get rid of it. And it seeps into our present and worries us about our futures. And this goes for Unionists and Nationalists who live there. And so it goes into our culture, it goes into our social relationships. So in the book, I've occasionally tried to use poetry and music as a way to illustrate how our culture connects us to our history, how the arts tries to help frame an understanding of our present and almost archive a narrative of our past. Quite often poetry is there as a sort of a cultural archive on all sides of the political divides. And one of my points is you can't really understand the unionist mind unless you understand the history of unionism. So I just want to give you now two poems about unionism that I think will give you a much better understanding of unionism than anything you would read in sort of a more academic text. So first of these poems was written 100 years ago by Rudyard Kipling, and it was written about the Home Rule crisis and the growing campaign for Irish self-government. And to me, it provides a perfect. You could just go back and forwards in a time machine to Brexit and understand why unionists are worried about Brexit now and worried about the Northern Ireland Protocol in the way that they worried about the Home Rule issue. So I'll just read this now and hope your eyes don't glaze over. If I see any eyes glazing over, I'll maybe stop. So this is Rudyard Kipling, Ulster, 1912, and starts this way. This is not the whole poem, but it's about 2/3 of it. The dark 11th hour draws on and sees us sold to every evil power we fought against of old. Rebellion, rapine hate, oppression, wrong and greed are loosed to rule our fate by England's act and deed. The faith in which we stand, the laws we made and guard, our honour, lives and land are given for reward. To murder done by night, to treason taught by day, to folly, sloth and spite, and we are thrust away. The blood our fathers spilt, our love, our toils, our pains, are counted us for guilt, and only bind our chains. Before an empire's eyes, the traitor claims his price. What need of further lies? We are the sacrifice. So this was quite an angry poem by Kipling about the betrayal of home rule on the Ulster Unionist community 100 years ago. And Carson, the sort of great Unionist leader, saw Northern Ireland's creation and partition as a disaster for Irish unionism. And that's one of the reasons he did not become the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. He thought it as a failure. And so the second poem was written by John Dew. It's much shorter, you'll be relieved to hear. And this was written about the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985, and exactly the same type of emotion comes through in this poet. And Hewitt's one of Northern Ireland's, greatest poets, in my opinion. These days the air is thick with bitter cries, as baffled thousands dream they are betrayed, stripped of the comfort of safe loyalties, their ancient friends considered enemies, alone among the nations and afraid. And here again, you had mass protests, a bit like Ulster Day during the Home Rule crisis. Ulster says no, resistance, a sense of sellout, betrayal, their identity was being sacrificed despite their own loyalty. And for me, a lot of the conflict dynamics you can see in culture, as well as in political science, and as well as in history. So the book tries to tap into that in a way that to convey some of the sort of human angle of it. And so the State of the Union, we are, as I said, we're 2 weeks into the second century. And I think Brexit makes, how far further will it get? I think Brexit raises that as a legitimate question now. And certainly 2016 as a date is up there on the calendar, along with Northern Ireland's creation in 1921, the emergence of the Civil Rights Movement in 1968, the suspension of the Majority Rule Parliament in 1972, which unionists dominated, the Anglo-Irish Agreement I've just mentioned in 1985, when the Irish government was given a role in Northern Ireland. We've got 2016 when Brexit referendum took place, and now we've got the centenary and 100 years celebrations. So we're 100 not out, but just about. And this picture is a picture of Seamus Heaney, and that is a painting that I think is in Queen's University, Belfast. And the Northern Ireland office printed Heaney's image on its centenary celebrations. And this became quite controversial in Northern Ireland because apparently Heaney's family had not been asked about this. I think the university said that that it had been asked, or that. So there's an issue to do with the appropriation of Seamus Heaney's image as an Irish poet on a project that celebrated Northern Ireland and celebrated Northern Ireland's existence, and it became quite a sort of controversial point. So some cheered, some booed, but most people didn't care less. And I would say most people in Britain, it passed them by. And this is quite problematic because the lack of understanding, I think, of the dynamics there, other than in a reactive way. So when you see, burning buses, then the media will trigger. But beyond that, there is quite often not a great understanding. As I said previously, Northern Ireland is a blind spot in the United Kingdom. In the Olympics, it's called Team GB. Now I know that's a marketing slogan, but it airbrushes Northern Ireland out of the representation. And effectively in politics, it's Team GB as well. And I would say that Brexit was the sort of Team GB version of the Olympics. Northern Ireland was a blind spot, and until it became the problem. They didn't see the problem coming. They've never seen the problem coming because there's no empathy and there's no remembrance of the historical background in the policy process, or at least there's not enough of it. just to make another point, Northern Ireland was an accident. It wasn't an objective for anybody. It was the least worst option. It was, a line was drawn on a map by the British government. They told unionists one thing about the border, nationalists another thing. We had 50 years where unionists won every election, nationalists lost every election. Nationalists became aggrieved, unionists became apathetic, and effectively Great Britain got on with it because, you know, they'd finally got Northern Ireland off the domestic agenda. But we're here 100 years later, you know, we're condemned to repeat the mistakes of the past. So we ended up with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 after a generation of ethno-national violence. And the whole point of the peace process and the agreement was this idea of constructive ambiguity. Now, you can sort of, it's easy to be cynical about that and say, well, you know, it was destructive ambiguity, which some degree it was, but you had to have, there was never a yes and a no, and you never really get yes and no in a negotiation. You get maybe, if you're lucky, somewhere between yes and no, somewhere in that space. And certainly the Good Friday Agreement was plumb in the middle, between yes and no. We could agree to differ. It parked our identities. It allowed us space to buy into either a British identity or an Irish identity, or both identities. It allowed us to have both or either of those. It provided some sort of, I suppose, room for maneuver within this zero-sum equation of, are you British or are you Irish? It also reduced the risk of spoilers on both sides because the agreement was very inclusive. It involved radical militant elements on both sides of the conflict. It had 10 political parties taking part in the mediated dialogue. It had the American government's involvement. It had the EU's involvement. It had 2 sovereign governments, Britain and Ireland, involved. It had a triple lock, which meant that there was a referendum within Northern Ireland on the agreement. It was passed in the British Parliament and the Irish Parliament as well. And it was passed and there was a referendum in the Irish Republic as well as the agreement and negotiations. So it was very inclusive. It was one of the reasons why it took years to develop. But it was imperfect. It left several difficult issues out for another day, specifically weapons decommissioning, the future of the police, and a couple of other things as well. So it didn't deal with everything, but it provided an infrastructure for some of those things to be dealt with. And it received a lot of support, 71% in Northern Ireland, 95% in the Irish Republic. And we had this sort of, I suppose, balancing act between accommodation versus reconciliation. Now, critics of the peace process would say it was quite good at accommodating the elites, but it was very bad at reconciling communities and individuals. And I think there's definitely some credibility in that. And in the book, I do, review the record of the ability of the post-agreement structures to deliver. And, it's been checkered at best. There's an ongoing debate, about the utility of power sharing. Okay, so can it work in theory? Does consociationalism actually work? Can it work in practice? If it can't, is there an alternative to it? The book is generally a critical friend of consociationalism, not uncritical, but and the book does, I suppose, put its cards down in terms of supporting the notion of power sharing, liberal consociationalism, or Northern Ireland's version of it, and certainly with Neo and Ed as well. We worked together on a USIP project that was really interesting in terms of trying to understand the way in which citizens think about policy options and how that can sometimes be very presented as very much a binary thing. How much do you like something, or how much do you not like it? But actually, in a real life setting of a negotiation, you're never really dealing with one policy in isolation. You're dealing with, and the Good Friday Agreement was all about nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. That was the sort of slogan. Which became a bit of a, I suppose, a soundbite. But what can you put up with to get something that you do want is maybe a more realistic way of putting it. And Ed, Laura Sudelich, and Neo project with myself tries to get under the skin of how would people trade things off, to get something that they can accept, and that's been quite an exciting venture. And certainly some of the aspects of that project are in the book, and made me think quite a lot about the potential. Because once you compare one issue with another issue, things can become slightly less zero sum. But nonetheless, it's been a bumpy experience, and it will continue to be that. The book's dedicated to Lyra McKee. That's a picture of Lyra McKee at the top right. Lyra McKee was a journalist in Northern Ireland who was shot dead by dissident Republicans in Derry. And to me, Lyra McKee was emblematic of the peace process. She was born after the peace process got moving. She was a very progressive individual, and she was an example of the future that Northern Ireland could have rather than the past that it did have. And her funeral was quite a cathartic experience. There's a picture of Arlene Foster and Mary Lou MacDonald in the centre, and Michelle O'Neill, and all the great and the good were at the funeral. And the priest stood up and he said, "Why does it take the death of a 29-year-old woman to get you people together?" And that went around the world and actually did stimulate the British government and the Irish government to convene talks, and embarrassed to some degree. I mean, they would deny that this is what it did, but it certainly was a catalyst for the restoration of the devolved institutions in Northern Ireland, in a way that a lot of other tragedies did not create the same dynamic, but certainly in this occasion it did. But we're still struggling, as you've probably seen with news over the last month. So we're a quarter of a century in, and we still get CAT written on bonfires. And CAT is an acronym which is Kill All Taigs, and Taigs being a brutalized sort of phrase for Catholic, if you're not familiar with it. There was a children's bonfire last July with a CAT written on it. Essentially, that's an instruction to genocide by parents to their children. So we can still get this, and it's still an extremely divided society, and the peace process has not been able to crack that. And one of the reasons is that the power sharing system actually provides very few incentives for cooperation across the ethno-national space, and it creates more reasons for people to resist change. And it's been quite good as a system to prevent things happening that you really don't like, but it's been much less good at effective governance for people at an individual level. And it hasn't really tackled divisions. It hasn't really tackled our contested past, because those issues have never really been agreed. We've agreed to disagree, but we've never really agreed to agree. And I've always remembered, and I quote this in the book, Tony Blair was a great man for a soundbite. And on the 10th of April, 1998, he gave a press conference. And he said there that the essence of what we have agreed is a choice. We're all winners or all losers. It's mutually assured benefit or mutually assured destruction. And that was quite a sort of binary option. And I think he was quite optimistic then that we would go for mutually assured benefit. But actually, peace is rarely binary, and we've had bits of both. We've had elements of mutually assured benefit and destruction simultaneously, sometimes simultaneously. And of course, we've now got new problems, and Brexit presented a new set of things that has further exposed the the fault lines in Northern Ireland. First of all, the peace process, as I said, was built on this ambiguity. It was built on the idea of the people's consent being sovereign, and when they consented to different arrangements, then they would get them. But Brexit was a binary choice, and the imposition of new borders potentially from beyond. So, so this builds on the breaking peace idea in the last book. And the last thing Northern Ireland needed was a binary choice, and that's what it got with Brexit. Brexit was defined almost as a unitary state phenomenon. So the country has decided to leave the EU. Well, that might be fine if you're living in, well, it probably isn't fine if you're living in Kent. But if you're living in Belfast, then you suddenly, some people will say, well, actually, my country's Ireland under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. It's not Britain. So the country has, and of course, Northern Ireland decided to stay in the EU, didn't decide to leave, as did Scotland. So Brexit was presented as a sort of unitary state phenomenon, when in fact 2 of the devolved regions had voted to remain in the EU. And we're given this binary, which side of the border are you going to jump to? Okay, so it squeezed the space that was necessary in Northern Ireland. The constructive ambiguity was sucked out of the political system. So immediately, the DUP said, we want to leave with the rest of our country. And Sinn Féin and Irish nationalists said, we want a border poll and Irish reunification because our self-determination has been denied. And it raised Brexit then, it forced us to confront this issue of who has the right to self-determination. Now, Brexit, of course, was not a devolved power, but the whole peace process was based on the rationale of consent. And that's what unionists wanted at the time, a majority consent in Northern Ireland. Wanted that recognised. And so how are we to operationalise self-determination? And as I said there, quite a heavy vote in Northern Ireland to remain in the EU. And if you like, the idea of consent was like a rug that was pulled from under people in Northern Ireland in 2016. And actually, they were confronted with the fact that actually it's London that calls the shots, even if you do have your own parliament. And with a region that was sort of quite keen on the idea of remaining, that was not very helpful. And so we've ended up now with the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the fallout from that. Boris Johnson got Brexit done, but only by imposing a border in the Irish Sea. The very thing he said no government could or should ever do, he has done. The Brexit, it was not the Brexit unionists thought they were getting for several years. And this brings us back to the poetry point and the existential crisis for unionist identity. Yet again, they put their trust in their patron state, and that trust has been misplaced. It's also energized then on the other side calls for a border poll and Irish reunification, and again, that had not really been on the front burner of political debate pre-Brexit. In fact, not at all. But post-Brexit, it's now a very live issue, as it is in Scotland, of course. And it makes the case for the union more difficult for unionists to make. I would say. Now, at the moment, unionists are sort of split. Some of them want to resist the whole notion that there will be any political change in Northern Ireland and that they're not even going to talk about it. Other unionists, like Peter Robinson, the former First Minister, wants unionists to start talking about it and say, putting your head in the sand is not a strategy. And we've had Arlene Foster's resignation as well. So it'll be interesting to see what the next leader of the DUP does about that. Just one point before I finish, because I've been talking for quite a while, is Anglo-Irish relations have also been diminished by the Brexit process, and they were like a foundation stone for the peace process. And again, that's probably not something that really makes the news, and I know there are some houses in Canterbury that don't have any foundations and are still standing, but it's much harder to keep your house up if you've no foundations. And Anglo-Irish relations really were the foundations for the peace process. And it's not going to help Northern Ireland if London and Dublin's interests are diverging. And it's hard to see how they will not diverge economically and politically post-Brexit as the years kick in. So, fragile peace. We've now got a crisis in unionism. So we've lost both leaders of the two main unionist parties. Arlene Foster has announced her resignation. The leader of the Ulster Unionist Party is also Steve Aikens, also announced his resignation. We're now facing a little bit of an uncertain future about where unionism wants to go in terms of the devolved structures in Northern Ireland. The border poll sort of drumbeat is unlikely to diminish, I think, over the coming couple of years. I would say, I would certainly put £1 on the table and say that in the next decade, we're going to have referendums on independence in Scotland and Northern Ireland. The outcome of those obviously is harder to judge, but I think it's coming in both places. But despite all that, there's one reality, and that reality is that while Northern Ireland is evolving and changing, how that is managed will determine our future. And without political structures that are viable, I think that is not going to. I think without political structures, our future is much more unstable and fragile than if we have the political parties and the political debate that's focused on issues to do with education, social policy, environmental policy, and health policy. Without that type of infrastructure, I think we're much more likely to go back into an identity politics type of argument. But we'll have to see where that one leads us. So I'll stop talking now and say thanks. The publisher has offered a discount on the book. If anybody wants to buy it direct from them, if you use that code, you can get 30% off. And that lasts the 30th of June. So I'll stop talking now, and we can maybe discuss. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Feargal. This was extremely inspiring at all levels, especially listening to the poems and all the recent developments, including the data from Northern Ireland, and brought back a lot of memories from Belfast and the time I spent in Northern Ireland. I might have mentioned that anecdote to you when I was interviewing for Queen's Belfast. I visited for a few days. And it was, I entered for the first time Belfast, I did my interview, and then I was spending not knowing what would be the outcome of the interview, who got me landed in Belfast for 5 years, and not knowing what the outcome will be. I was starting to talk to all the wrong people. So I spent a few days talking to people on both sides of the divide, and then my flight time came and I went to the airport, and then I got an announcement. Mr. Loizides, please come to the police, please come to the airport police. And I look at I very often lose my passport in the airport. So I have my passport, I have everything with me. So I was trying to think what I have done wrong. Should I start running away? And I went to the police, and they said, we have to apologize to you. And I said, well, why do you need to apologize to me? The police officer who saw your passport didn't realize that Cyprus is now in the European Union, and he stamped your passport. You're now in the European Union, welcome. And we really apologize for stamping your passport. And I couldn't figure, my surprise was enormous, obviously. But that anecdote says everything about what the EU has done for Northern Ireland, how things have changed. So my first question is, are people settling with the idea that they wouldn't be part of the EU until the foreseeable future, and there going to be a new, until that time, there will be a new referendum, or is it still a shock and simmering anger as to what have happened to Northern Ireland as a result of the Brexit process?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. And it's a good question. In some ways, I think the whole Brexit issue in Northern Ireland has been slightly sort of reversed, because most of the worry, I think, from 2016 to 2019 was the idea of a border in Ireland. And and the other thing probably to mention about Brexit that I haven't done yet is that there was a massive overlap between Brexit and the ethno-national schism, if you like. So 90% of nationalists were pro-Remain, and only about 38 to 40% of unionists were pro-Remain. So Brexit, even though the DUP actually was relatively sort of agnostic initially about Brexit back in the, Union, and the UUP was pro-Remain in the referendum, but subsequently after the vote, they hardened up their positions, quite idiotically in some ways, really. I think they tied their futures to a policy they couldn't control, which for a political party is not a good idea. But nonetheless, they did it. And it became what Arlene Foster called a blood red line for them. The blood red line being leaving in the same way that the rest of the country leaves, right? That was a blood red line, and that was the line that Boris Johnson ditched, right, when he did the deal with Varadkar in the EU. Now, the reason why I'm saying it sort of flipped a bit is because, yes, the frustration with Brexit, whenever it was overlapped with the idea of an Irish border on the island of Ireland, yes, that produced a lot of anger amongst the Irish nationalist side, who were more pro-Remain, less anger amongst the unionist side. But we've now got a scenario where, which is sort of ironic, is that the pain has really been experienced, well, by everybody in terms of trade complications, but existentially, the pain is now being suffered by the unionist community, because they feel that they are now got a different type of Britishness to people in Kent and elsewhere in Great Britain, which has played into their whole existential fears from Home Rule to the Good Friday Agreement, the Anglo-Irish Agreement. And so that, to some degree, I think, has mitigated the nationalist Remainer aggro, if you like, to put it simplistically. And to some degree, if I was a Sinn Féin election strategist, I would be thinking, thank you, God, for Boris Johnson. Thank you for Boris Johnson. He is the best election agent for Irish unification we have ever had. Thank you for Arlene Foster, I'd probably be saying, because the DUP have played a blinder in terms of pushing the unification agenda forwards in a way that Sinn Féin probably haven't done. So I think that it's the point about, are they up in arms now that there's a border in the Irish Sea and now that Brexit's operational? Obviously, unionists are, in a way that they didn't think they were going to be, because of the fact that this border is now shifted. Some nationalists are too, because they just want to remain in the EU. But I think the radical nationalist side see a benefit down the line in using the European Union, and this is a difference with Scotland. Sorry to harp on now, but I'll stop in a second. But the difference between independence in Scotland and that agenda and the reunification agenda in Ireland is that the European Union has already said that a unified Ireland would automatically be in the EU, doesn't have to reapply for membership. And that's not the case in Scotland. So if I was a shrewd Sinn Féin election strategist, which I'm not, I would be thinking, let's push the reunification issue as a vehicle for our Irish nationalist ambitions, and push that. And so in some ways, the operation of Brexit, you could see, is quite a useful thing for Irish nationalism if you're on that side of the spectrum, I suppose.
Thank you, Feargal. I saw a hand earlier. I think it was from Andrea. No, no, it was
no.
so.
I was just clapping.
Okay, sorry, that was something. Yeah. Hi, Harmony. Yeah.
I'll ask a question. Hi, Feargal. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to see all of you. My question is I mean, it's not very political sciencey, but I'm still curious. It's in the relationship between London and Belfast, right? So to a certain degree, is it to the advantage of peace that that London ignores Northern Ireland? Because there's on one side there's a notion of institutional power in London, which you can't sort of ignore. There is institutional power on the future of Northern Ireland that resides in London, and there's not much you can do about that. On the other side, if you have a government like the current government that has no or very little reliance on anything to do with Northern Ireland for its own survival and for its own sort of functioning, and would only use Northern Ireland for its own benefit, right, seems to have very little interest in actually what happens to Northern Ireland, or Ireland more broadly, even less. So the question then I wonder is there a possibility that something happens on the ground while London is busy elsewhere? Or is that just an impossibility because of the institutional power that London has?
Good to see you, Harmony, and great question. I think, well, I think my view would be that the United Kingdom is responsible for Northern Ireland, all right, and it needs to take. And I think that the history of the last 100 years has been not always. It's been, it hasn't always been consistently useful, if I could put it that way. For instance, when the political system broke down in the 1960s, the UK government, it's tended to have the least interventionist policy possible. That's then incrementally become more interventionist, but too late to do anything useful, right? Or be as useful as it could be. So when things broke down in the 1960s, it subcontracted the British Army to a failing unionist government, as you know, and that therefore politicized the British Army very quickly because it was used for internment, mostly against the Catholic community, but not exclusively. So I think we need an engaged UK state. It is a co-guarantor of peace. And I think part of the problems have been when it hasn't looked like it's been even-handed over what it's doing. And I'll give you one example of that, which was the general election in 2017, when it established a competence supply agreement with the DUP. Now, there you had the Secretary of State was then tarnished because it looked like the strings of the British government were being pulled by a party that was keeping it in power. Similar with John Major back in the mid-1990s. That was one of the reasons the IRA ceasefire broke down in 1996, was because John Major was in a minority government. He was held in power by the Unionists and didn't hold talks with Sinn Féin, and they ran out of patience. And if you're going to govern, then you need to govern. And if the Northern Ireland is currently in the United Kingdom, and therefore it needs a engaged government. Another thing, anomaly, probably, I don't know if this is linked to your question, but another anomaly really is that one of the weirdnesses, I suppose, of Northern Ireland is that we don't vote for the government. We have no real control over the government that's in control of the region. So we vote for I know there are, the Tories organized there, but they're never going to get elected there in the foreseeable. So, we have our own micro political climate, but yet we are governed by, well, the Tories for the foreseeable, unless I'm misguided on that one, in London, right? And so there's almost like a philosophical democratic question there, actually, about not having access or to the government that's going to be in control. So there's a value in devolved government, certainly, and local control. And I think public health has demonstrated that. COVID's been handled. Is the one issue where, you know, the virus doesn't discriminate. It discriminates on wealth grounds, but it doesn't discriminate on religious grounds. And they've got that, but that's been useful. But I think it needs a coherent government that's engaged and not inconsistent in what it does.
Well, Feargal, thanks very much. It's I think it's a really fine book, and it's you know, very, one of the things that really impresses me about this book and all your work is, you know, how you manage to be so balanced and judicious and see, you know, you very much see both sides of the story, and you constantly put things from both points of view. And I think it's very effective too, the way you've brought your own voice into the book and, you know, comment on events. You manage to kind of give quite a kind of funny, wry perspective, but manage to keep the impartiality. So that's really impressive. And there's, the book's full of fantastic jokes too. So it's actually, you know, despite the kind of, you know, some of the grim background story, it's leavened and light, and that's terrific. There was one thing that's really interesting in one of the last 2 chapters where you talk about the changes in identity, and the recent surveys which show that now about a third identify as British, a third as Irish, and a third as Northern Irish. And I was just wondering what you make of that, and you know, sort of, it's interesting in light of the Gormley statue. You know, it's that third group of Northern Irish. Are they actually the loyalists? Is it a bad thing that's there, or is it somehow? Could that be a move in a positive direction? What would be a positive identity?
Thanks, Hugh, and great to see you. And very good point. You know, this comes back to, I suppose, the point I was making about change is happening, even though it might look like nothing's really changing. There's a tectonic change that's going on there. I think that this other group, so we've got about 20% of the electorate that is say non-aligned. I wouldn't necessarily put it as they're Northern Irish, but their identity certainly isn't just British or Irish. They're a sort of the other or neither group. That's quite a significant proportion of the electorate, and you can see that with it's actually the rise of the Alliance Party vote, which in several elections now has got really critical and strong. And I suppose one of the ironies of this is that the day-to-day incentives for the political parties are to mobilize the faithful, to speak to the core, but their strategic objective really needs to be to speak to this other group, you know, to speak to the non-aligned group, because it's that group that will determine Northern Ireland. It's the undecideds who will decide on where Northern Ireland goes. And I saw somebody say the other day on the TV that, so we've now got an election in the Democratic Unionist Party. We'll have to see where that goes in the next week or two, but you know, it could go in a more fundamentalist direction, which would be, I think, welcomed by a lot of traditional DUP supporters. But their problem is that they are in a shrinking pool of fundamentalists. And what they need to be doing is making their party and the union more attractive to these non-aligned third, or maybe it's not quite a third, but it's certainly 15, 20% of the electorate, you know, do not define themselves as Irish or British. And that's growing. It's a young vote. It's a secular vote. It's a progressive vote. It's a growing demographic with every election. And so that's what we're going to be interesting to watch, the extent to which parties try and speak to that new electorate in Northern Ireland. It's also linked, I think, to frustration with the dysfunctionality of the political system there. It has been a relatively dysfunctional form of devolved government. It broke down for years. From 2017 to 2020, didn't exist. It was suspended. So some of that non-aligned vote is also just, I think, a plague in all your houses. We want an alternative to this, but I think that's where the future lies. The extent to which those parties engage with that electorate. We'll have to see where they go with that, how they do that.
If there is no other question, I'll ask the next one. Feargal, how do you see the changing landscape of intellectual agendas in the Northern Ireland conflict? And particularly curious to know your view on some of the recent work by Brendan O'Leary and others already thinking, preparing, talking about an all-Ireland referendum, and even discussing how a united Ireland should look like in terms of being a federation, a confederation, a multi-unit federation, and how it will come about.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, I mean, for political scientists, it's fantastic, because we've now got almost the gates opened for intellectual discussion about models of change. And there's also an interest in some sections of unionism for that discussion as well. Not in all sections, but certainly in some. So I'm relatively agnostic, I think, in terms of the options. I'm more interested in the actual getting on with it and fleshing out some of the different directions that it might go in. I think the biggest worry would be that we do a Brexit. So Brexit happened with very little discussion beyond just yes or no, so what happens next? And I think from Brendan and others, there is more of an attempt to actually then sort of lay out some alternatives. And I think that the Irish government, similarly, and the British government, are very resistant to pulling the trigger on a border poll without some more sense of what would people be voting for, what would they be buying into. And I think on the Irish nationalist side of the fence, they realise that that there is almost an obligation if you're going to change the status quo. And I think Brexit's been quite cathartic in that as well. I think they've learned from the fact that Brexit happened and then there was this chasm of, well, what's next and how do we do that? And I think they have learned from that. Some factions, certainly the Irish government, has set up its own unit, a shared island unit. There's various other units around and think tanks around that are looking into the options. Some of it's simply rhetorical. Some of it is actually just talking about it, seeing what attitudes are, loosening up from just having silence about the option. So I think one of these is just a discursive matter. And then I think second wave is what are the political options? And one option is and those options are also methodological. So recently we've had suggestions that, well, timing's an issue. When should there be a border poll? Former Irish Taoiseach Bertie Ahern said we should have a border poll in 2028, to sort of connect with the Good Friday Agreements, 1998 thing. That would be a reasonable timeline for a referendum. The current Irish government said we need to have reconciliation before the border poll. A border poll now would be damaging. It would be too problematic to have it. some people want weighted majority before there's any change. And this is interesting because I think when the Good Friday Agreement was reached in 1998, none of them were really thinking that much about the modalities of actually what would happen if there was reunification and how would that happen. And I think if I'm right about this, that the Good Friday Agreement, A, is a bit vague on the triggering mechanism. So it would be the British government that would trigger it, but on what basis would be when they're satisfied that there would be a majority support for change. That is a bit woolly, potentially. But then there's also this point about if you had 50% of the vote plus one, is that enough to leave the United Kingdom and have Irish unification? Well, the Good Friday Agreement would seem to suggest yes. But practical political dynamics now, particularly on the Irish government side, would be very worried about that notion. And the current Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, has pretty much stated that that wouldn't be his preferred option, as did Leo Varadkar previously. So I think where we're now at is a discussion about, is it a good idea in principle? What would the rules be? What should the timing be? Some people in the Republic of Ireland, in Fianna Fáil, have suggested guaranteed places in the Irish cabinet, for instance. But I think what we'll end up with is change that nobody actually expected in the first place. I don't think that the Irish Republic has really thought through how is the Republic going to change to accommodate 1 million Northern Protestants who don't want to be there, or how are they going to attract them into something that's inclusive and attractive, and win this group. Some people that won't be won over, but how would you construct, an Ireland that was inclusive and attractive to nationalists and unionists? We're only really starting down that path. I think Brexit is pushing us down that path, but we're only really starting down there. Yes, federalism is one option, unitary state's another option. Likelihood would be a parliament in Belfast would be quite likely, I think. But we'll have to see where that debate goes. But I'm relatively agnostic on the various models, I think, at this point. I just like the conversation to get moving, and I from a professional point of view, I'm very interested in engaging with it.
Absolutely, that's an exciting topic, because you can bring forward all the potential models in front of stakeholders, but also the students. We have fascinating discussions with the students as to can we move the parliament, can we move the dial to Belfast and keep the Supreme Court in Derry and have all kinds of adaptations to the Republic. Not only just adaptations, it's changing the whole structure of the Irish state in order to make it more inclusive.
I mean, there was a poll done last couple of weeks ago that suggested in the Irish Republic there is quite a lot of support for the idea of a border poll, but it is quite shallow. So this is coming back to the point of when you connect that with another issue. So when it's connected with the issue of economics, then the enthusiasm. So in other words, that I reunify, and this is, Nadine, maybe germane to your own experience in Germany. Once you connect the idea of reunification with economic cost, then it's not quite as, people there aren't quite as keen. So, I think that there's a lot of fear at the moment, actually. I think there's fear of change. There's fear amongst some unionists that their political leadership is not effectively resisting change. They're afraid of change. They're afraid of the notion of a reunified Ireland. I don't think Irish nationalism has really done very much at all to allay those fears by saying, here's an attractive model. Isn't that much nicer than the union? That they haven't gone really down that path very significantly that I can see. And I think people in the Irish Republic are afraid as well of Neil, how, you know, if this happens, you know, is the flag going to be changed, or our sort of cultural practices going to be changed? Is our electoral system, you know, going to change? How much is it going to cost? All those types of themes, I think, have been triggered by Brexit, actually. And I don't think they're going to stop. I think they're going to evolve further, probably.
Ed.
Yeah, thanks for that, Feargal. I suppose my question was really just on the last part of what you just said there, actually, which was about the elites, both in the Republic of Ireland and in the EU as a whole, right? Basically wanting to take Northern Ireland on, right? So it just struck me, right, that it just makes things hugely complicated, right, for them, right? And while it's difficult, if there's a kind of strong kind of push in Northern Ireland for unity, it's difficult for them to avoid, right? But I can just imagine that it's just not something that they want to do, right? They don't want to take on this fraying bit of the British Empire, right? And they just would want to kind of keep away from it for a very, very long time. So and so, I mean, one might predict, right, that what we'll see is just endless discussion, right, with no conclusion, right? And in some respects, Northern Ireland might start to resemble Cyprus, right? In the sense that there's a lack of a incentive, right, for people to really reach agreements on these issues, because actually reaching agreements will increase the costs that people have to pay. Whereas they remain insubstantiated, right? Everybody can kind of like posture without actually having to obey the, to pay the costs, right? So I was wondering, to what extent you thought elites in Northern Ireland were really at all interested. I mean, in the Republic of Ireland, were really at all interested in taking on the North.
Thanks, Ed, and as ever, a very good question from you. Not an easy one to answer. I think I wrote something last week or a couple of weeks ago about this, and rhetorically, I think what's happening is that political realities and political dynamics are racing ahead of the rhetoric of the Irish state, and almost the comfortable rhetoric of wanting something but not immediately, right? So there's been a big rhetorical, and it almost been like a state project to reunify the island. And one of the principles of the peace process was, as you know, changing Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution into just more of an amorphous form rather than an immediate project. And I think that the Irish Republic has been quite comfortable wanting but not getting Irish reunification. And I think once you start to have to model getting it, then it becomes more problematic domestically. And I think that is exactly the space that the Irish Republic is in at the moment. Now, it was interesting that the Irish Taoiseach pushed back against the idea of a border poll on St. Patrick's Day when he was speaking to Irish America. And, we've got a Biden presidency that, Biden's very much wrapping himself in the idea that he's sort of an Irish member of the Irish diaspora, which he is, which is also connects to Brexit, because I think that has partly shaped Boris Johnson's Brexit strategy, the fact that Biden won and Trump didn't. Not to say that America is pushing a reunification agenda, they're not doing that, but I think the Irish Taoiseach was trying to push back against a clamoring within Irish America for a border poll and to sort of decelerate this political dynamic. And I think that, yes, I think that there will be, I think discussion is more important than the destination for the political elites in the South. Having said that, they do need to have that. It'd be very difficult if you were a policy maker. It'd be very difficult to sort of engage at a policy level when you've had so little thinking through of where you're going. And if we were to look benevolently on the shared island unit of the Taoiseach, we could see it as a vehicle for a think space for change. But I think if you were to look at it less benevolently, it would be exactly what you were saying. It is the ship that will never reach port. It is a discussion that will never finish. It is a, it is a way of containing the debate without the denouement that would be politically damaging. And of course, governments work in very short timeframes. So let's leave that to the next administration. So I think in the North, what's interesting is that moderate nationalists, because of Brexit, have been pushed into that space in a way that maybe they didn't expect to go, because instead of accepting the status quo of being in the United Kingdom, within the EU, in a devolved United Kingdom, they're now facing an equation where they're in the UK, outside the European Union, outside a space where devolution is valued by the United Kingdom government. So Boris Johnson said Scotland's devolution was a terrible mistake. So we're seeing a more of a status quo that's dominated by the Conservative Party in England than a European United Kingdom identity, and that's pushed a lot of Northern nationalists who might have not had a reunification project further into that space. And I think that might be putting pressure on the Irish elite. And where they're going to be, I think, in trouble is if there is a real critical mass and traction for a border poll that becomes irresistible. And we'll have to see if that happens. But I think it will take a while for that to build up a head of steam. And the interesting thing will be, look at Irish elections. Now, the game changer in this could be if Sinn Féin enter government in the South. That would be, very interesting. But let's look at Irish elections and the extent to which a border poll becomes a real live political issue in an Irish election in the Irish Republic. And if it does, then I think that's where a border poll becomes a more realistic phenomenon.
One last question by Richard.
Feargal, thanks very much. That was a very incredibly interesting talk. I suppose the thing that I wanted to ask you was when you, in the process of rewriting the book, what have you learned about what any of the parties might have to give up in order to make progress? Just given that we're no longer in the territory of you don't have to choose and the space between yes and no, and you can have your cake and eat it. Ironically, given how much Johnson is loathed across the board in Northern Ireland, what is it that any of the parties have to give up in order to change things for the better?
Oh, that's a great question, Richard. I think unionists have to. I mean, I'd be loath to tell unionists or nationalists what they need to do, right? But from a sort of an intellectual position, and I think this might relate to England's relationship with Scotland equally, putting the wagons in a circle is not a strategy that's going to work for unionism. Resisting using the tactics of home rule or using the tactics of 100 years ago, is not going to work. So currently, the leadership candidates for the DUP say they're going to bring the protocol down. They're going to destroy the protocol by boycotting meetings. That is not going to destroy the protocol. It's not going to make a dent in the trade border in the Irish Sea. So I think unionism has to appeal to this non-aligned group, and it's got to make a case for the union that is not homophobic, that is not creationist, right? That is not just the sort of traditional unionist voter. They've got to go out beyond that, I think, and sell the union as a 21st century concept, which they could do if they chose to do that. But I think it's easier not to do that day to day. That's the point I was making earlier. And I think similarly, maybe in the same mode of that, I think nationalists' best chance, if you say, you know, nationalist in the sense of wanting Irish unification, and not all nationalists really do want that, but for those Irish nationalists who really do want reunification, the best way of getting that is to attract the non-aligned and to attract unionists into a modern notion. Why would unity be better than a union with Britain? What's not just campaigning for it, you know, triggering a border poll, and most of the nationalist energy really is about trying to trigger a border poll, trying to get that conversation moving. But what is their killer application, if you like, that would attract a unionist? Now, maybe the EU membership is that, right? For Remainer unionists, that's one of those issues that could be. What is Irish nationalism going to, you know, give to unionists that might get them to buy into their agenda? Now, one of those things might be, a more coherent system of checks and balances, a greater buffer in Belfast from, you know, authority in Dublin, a change to the sort of cultural symbols of Gaelic culture, and so on. But to simply say, as soon as we've got the numbers, we're leaving, that is one strategy, but you're not going to get as much buy-in to your agenda as you could do. And so I think that's where the smart money would be on in terms of the movement, and I think that's what both probably have to do to make progress.
It's interesting. It's taken 100 years for, you know, the people in the South not to have that conversation because they just haven't bothered. I mean, they haven't. You know, the Northern Irish Protestants have correctly viewed the South as, you know, Pope-ridden, backward, socially conservative. You know, all the things. You know, poor. Everything that they didn't want to be.
Yes, and I think that, you know, the case for the union back 100 years ago was also about the economics, and it was also about, you know, the Catholic Church as well. But if you're to look now at the Irish Republic, it can't be demonized, you know, as home rule is Rome rule. You know, clearly it isn't. It's a well-educated, industrialized country. It's in the European Union. The case for the union is harder for unionists now to make, but it's still there to be made. And borders separate, and it's not just, you know, the fact that we've had 100 years of a border, and quite a militarized border for a generation, has meant that you know, that there has been a veering away of the South and the North, you know, over time. And one of the things the peace process did was it made that chill factor much less, you know. And I've given this anecdote before, but I think in the book, I've interviewed a journalist and said, you know, what was the best thing about the peace process, the Good Friday Agreement? Was it the North-South bodies? And this was an Irish nationalist leaning newspaper. Was it the North-South bodies, or was it power sharing and Sinn Féin and government? And they said, no, it was the motorway. That was the best thing about the peace process, because you could live in Belfast and work in Dublin. You could work in Dublin and live in Belfast. The organic connections were just more easy. It wasn't a big deal. And it was actually day to day very useful, you know, in a way that maybe the grand politics wasn't quite so important. And that's why Brexit has been more of an issue, which is, you know, once you put borders down, they automatically psychologically and physically divide people, and that I think is what we've seen over the last 100 years. That the peace process has chipped away at, and you know, it also took the Irish state most of that century to get over partition themselves, you know, and get over their own civil war in the 1920s. So, you know, these things take time. So it's probably my get out phrase would be.
Great. Richard, is that a legacy hand or?
No, it's an old hand. I'll take it down.
Okay. Thank you very much again, everybody. And of course, Feargal, inspiring talk. I have also added the chat, the link to the discount for the book. The recording for this event will be available at the CARC YouTube channel. Hopefully, that will be uploaded in the next few days. And I'll be looking forward to staying in touch with everybody as to future events. Thank you very much, Feargal, and thank you very much, everybody. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Feargal. That's really interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.